Hi you guys, and welcome back to my channel. So for today's video, I know that this story has been told many times, but I really wanted to cover it anyway because it's one of those stories that has never ever left me. I can't seem to shake this story, and when I don't understand something, I have such a hard time moving on and just letting it go. And this is one of those cases where I just don't understand a lot of it, so I really wanted to research it and try and find as much information as I possibly could. I was honestly trying to do so many things that I've never done before since this took place in a different country, and since the girls are from a different country, everything was done in a different language. It was hard to separate fact from fiction, and a lot of fiction is surrounding this story. There's so many inconsistencies, and it's probably because the reporting was done in different languages and there was just a lot of confusion when they went missing. So I really wanted to try and get the actual facts in this case, things that actually happened based on what people who were living there said and based on what was said from credible sources early on in the investigation. I was actually going through message boards that were in a different language and going message by message in those message boards and putting them in Google Translate to try and understand everything. I was that deep into it because I really wanted to get all the information and put it into this video. I actually came across one program that was really in-depth, that had interviews with the actual people that Kris and Lisanne spoke to in the days leading up to their disappearance, but it was done in Spanish, and I am not fluent in Spanish, so I actually had my phone while the video was playing and put it down to the speakers to try and have it go through Google Translate. It was not successful, but that's how hard I was trying to get all of the information, so hopefully I got most of it in this video. I didn't get everything, most likely, but everything that I did find, I'm putting into this video. So hopefully in this video you'll learn some new information, some information you haven't heard before, and maybe we can get a productive conversation going, because I don't think all of the questions have been answered in this case, and I think that there's some questions that just can't be answered, but I think that we can certainly look at the evidence and see what makes the most sense. So without further delay, today we're going to be talking about the mysterious deaths of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon. Kris Kremers was born on August 9th, 1992 in Amersfoort to her parents Roelle and Hans Kremers. Kris was described as being an open and creative woman who loved to write and journal in her diary. She was intelligent, took her studies seriously, and went on to graduate from the University of Utrecht with a degree in cultural social education with a specialization in art education. Lisanne Froon was born on September 24th, 1991 in Amersfoort to her parents Dini and Peter Froon. Lisanne was a gifted athlete who loved to play volleyball. She was described as being an extremely adventurous young woman who was always looking for a thrill. She was also described as being optimistic, intelligent, and motivated. She loved skydiving, trying new things, and staying active. She was also a really good student and ended up graduating from college with a degree in applied sciences. Lisanne and Kris were extremely close with one another, and they shared a lot of the same interests and hobbies. After both girls graduated from college, they decided that they wanted to travel more and see different parts of the world, and Panama seemed like the perfect destination. They wanted to take the trip to see the sights, learn Spanish, and give back to the community by volunteering and spending time with the children there. This was a huge deal for both girls, and they were excited, but 22-year-old Lisanne and 21-year-old Kris knew that they were going to have to start saving up in order to afford their dream trip. Lisanne moved into a dorm with Kris, and the two women took a job at a local cafe called Inden Klein & Hap, where they worked for the next 6 months, saving all of their money. By the time March of 2014 rolled around, Kris and Lisanne were ready to go. They had worked hard for the last 6 months, and they were eager to get to their destination. Finally, on March 15th, 2014, the girls arrived in Panama. When they arrived, everything was smooth sailing. For the first 2 weeks, the girls were having an amazing time, and they were exploring the region of Bocas del Toro. They were meeting new people, and they were just having a great time together. Then, on March 29th, they traveled to the small mountain town of Boquete for the second part of the trip, where they had arranged to live with a host family for a month. For this part of the trip, Kris and Lisanne were exploring the beautiful area, learning the Spanish language at an all-inclusive language school called Spanish by the River, and doing volunteer work. And everything was great at first. The two were busy studying, meeting fellow students and locals, and started planning things to do for when they had some free time. It should have been a life-changing experience for both women, but just a few days after arriving in Boquete, Kris and Lisanne would go missing. On April 1st, Kris and Lisanne woke up and did some research on the Pianista Trail, which is a trail that would lead them to the Continental Divide, which is a beautiful lookout that reportedly gives you the best view of the region. At the time, there wasn't a lot of information available about it online. However, since they did look it up, the girls weren't completely unfamiliar with it. At some point that day, they also met a man at the Spanish by the River school. According to reports, the man was an experienced local guide who was very well known in the area. The man, who I'm going to leave unidentified for reasons you'll understand later on in this video, offered Kris and Lisanne a great deal, which included a guided hike up to the Continental Divide and an overnight stay at his ranch house that was deep in the jungle. Kris and Lisanne declined the offer, but the two girls did agree to meet up with the guide for a tour of a ranch in Alto Quial the following day. Now, for reasons unknown, instead of going up to the Continental Divide with the experienced guide, Kris and Lisanne chose to go up there by themselves on April 1st. Just for some background, the Pianista Trail is a little under 2.5 miles outside of Boquete. Its entrance is easily accessible, however, the trail isn't known to be well traveled. It's known for its very unique canyon-esque path, with the sides of the trail actually towering over you at certain points. It directs you right into the cloud forest, which essentially means that the majority of the hike is in the clouds. Once you hit the summit or the Continental Divide, you usually make your way back the same way that you came in. The path does continue forward, but it is not the Pianista and it is unmarked. It actually takes you further into the jungle and does not circle back around to Boquete. According to many who have hiked the Pianista, the 2.6-mile trail is pretty straightforward with more than 2,000 feet of elevation. For healthy, active individuals, the trail out and back is between 3 to 5 hours. Shortly after researching the trail, the girls went to brunch at the Restaurante Nelvis with two young Dutchmen whom they had met. Shortly after that, around 11 a.m., Kris and Lisanne caught a taxi and set off for the Pianista Trail and were accompanied by a dog named Blue. Now, when you hear this story, most of the time people say that Blue was their host family's dog. However, Blue, I believe, belonged to the owner of the restaurant that is located right by the entrance of the Pianista. So I've heard both versions. One version, Blue is the host family's dog. Second version is that Blue belongs to the owner of the restaurant that is located right by the Pianista Trail. And I believe the accurate one is that he belonged to the owner of the restaurant by the Pianista. Either way, Kris and Lisanne were accompanied by a dog named Blue. Both girls were dressed in extremely light clothing and only brought the few items that they could fit in Lisanne's backpack. They didn't bring any extra clothing or food, and based on what they were wearing and what they brought, it was pretty clear that they weren't planning on being gone for long and intended to return the same day. When their cab driver Leo Gonzalez dropped them off at the trailhead that day, both women didn't have a care in the world and headed up the path and into the clouds. No one would see or hear from Kris Kremers or Lisanne Froon again. Now, later that day, at some point, the alarm was raised. Now, when it comes to this part of the story, there are so many different versions, and the most common one is that the host family that the girls were staying with saw that Blue the dog came back and that the girls didn't. However, I don't believe that's what actually happened. Later that day, the owner of the language school where Kris and Lisanne were studying realized that the girls had not returned, and she became concerned and went to their host family and asked if they knew where Kris and Lisanne were. The host family did not know where Kris and Lisanne were, and at that point the owner of the language school and fellow students were a little bit concerned. Even though they were concerned, they thought that maybe Kris and Lisanne had just changed their plans without telling them. Again, they were both young adults and there was a pretty decent nightlife in Boquete, so at that point they just thought that the plans had been changed and that they hadn't told anyone. They searched around the nearby area for the women, but ultimately decided to sleep on it before raising the alarm because both Kris and Lisanne were adults. However, everything changed the next morning on April 2nd when Kris and Lisanne missed their appointment with the experienced travel guide who was supposed to take them to the nearby ranch. When the women didn't arrive, the guide decided to go to their hostel and their host family to ask where they were. Some reports say that the guide actually went into Kris and Lisanne's room and looked around, which I'll definitely be coming back to since that is very sketchy. After realizing that the women had never made it back to their room, they immediately notified the authorities, and a fellow student called Lisanne's mother back in the Netherlands. When both women's parents heard about the news, they were completely shocked and panicked. Both Kris and Lisanne were very responsible people and had been in regular contact with them since they had left for Panama. However, neither family had heard from their daughter since they had left for the Pianista. On the following day, April 3rd, authorities began conducting aerial searches of the forest, and locals and guides began to organize various searches on foot. And the man leading the search was the trail guide that Kris and Lisanne were supposed to meet. However, they didn't turn up anything on these trails, and there was still no sign of the women anywhere. By April 6th, CNPROC, which is short for Panama's National Civil Protection Agency, officially began searching for the women and asked the locals who had been searching to actually step down. According to local guide John Tornblum, the entire search operation, in his own words, was a complete clusterfuck. And he said that he and other local guides knew the area better than anyone else, and he said that he did not understand why they were asked to step down in the searches. When they were later asked about this, CNPROC confirmed that they had started searching for the women on April 6th, 4 days after they had gone missing, and said that the search operation was very difficult because they didn't know where to search due to not knowing where the women were headed. Over the next couple of days back in the Netherlands, both the Kremers and Froons began to realize that something was terribly wrong. No good news was coming from the ground in Panama, and they hadn't had any contact with their daughters in days, which again was out of character for both women. Finally, on April 6th, both the Froons and the Kremers traveled to Panama to help with the searches, along with Dutch police and search and canine units. They searched the forest extensively for 10 days, but there was nothing to be found. No pieces of clothing, no cell phones, no witnesses, no clues, no Kris, no Lisanne. The search eventually slowed down and began to go cold. Minutes turned to hours, hours turned to days, and days turned into weeks, and the family still had zero answers. The case absolutely rocked the small, quiet town of Boquete, and there was confusion and outrage back in Europe. Where were the women, and what had happened to them? Then, on June 14th, around 10 weeks after Kris and Lisanne disappeared, a break came in the case when an Indigenous woman turned in a blue backpack to the authorities, and authorities discovered that the backpack was the same backpack that Lisanne had taken with her when her and Kris had gone on the hike. The woman claimed that she found the backpack in a rice paddy near the Nagobi village of Alto Romero on the banks of the Rio Calibra. This location was approximately 12 hours away from the Continental Divide. When the woman turned the backpack in, she stated very firmly that the backpack had not been there the day before. When authorities looked at the backpack, they saw that it was in pretty good shape and that all of the personal belongings inside were also in good condition. When authorities looked inside the backpack, they found Kris and Lisanne's cell phones, Lisanne's passport, $83, Lisanne's camera, 2 bras, 2 pairs of sunglasses, and a bottle of water. For police, the biggest pieces of evidence from Lisanne's backpack were Kris and Lisanne's cell phone and Lisanne's camera. When they began to pull phone records and look at cell phone activity, they came across a disturbing revelation. Just a few hours after taking off for their hike, something had gone horribly wrong because the girls began to place multiple calls to various emergency numbers. The first call to 112, which is the international emergency number, came in from Kris's iPhone at 4:39 p.m. A short time later, at 4:51 p.m., a call was placed to 112 from Lisanne's Samsung Galaxy. However, neither of the calls actually made it through due to poor reception. According to call logs, the girls didn't attempt to reach out for help for the rest of the day. However, the emergency call attempts continued up again from both phones on April 2nd and April 3rd. On April 4th, Kris's phone was powered on twice to check for a signal. On the day of April 5th, Lisanne's phone was turned on to check for a signal and was accessed for the final time due to her battery dying. Activity continued on Kris's phone, but there was something strange. The National Forensics Lab in Holland released a report on the cell phone records and concluded that after April 5th, Kris's phone was turned on multiple times, but that the PIN number was entered incorrectly each time, which was very strange. Who was trying to get into Kris's phone? Obviously, it wasn't Kris because she would know her own PIN, so who had possession of Kris's phone? On April 6th, Kris's iPhone was powered on to check for a signal. However, again, whoever was using it didn't have the password and was unable to enter the accurate PIN code. Between April 7th and April 10th, a total of 77 attempts were made to check for a signal. On April 11th, there was more activity on Kris's phone when it was powered on to check for a signal at 10:56. Again, whoever was handling the phone was unable to enter the accurate PIN code, and the last activity on Kris's phone was an hour and 5 minutes later at 11:56 when it was powered off for the final time. In total, Kris and Lisanne had placed 7 calls to emergency numbers, and only one of the calls went through, but it dropped after just 1 second. Due to the disturbing call logs, authorities were able to determine that Kris and Lisanne had been desperately trying to call for help for 10 whole days before Kris's phone was powered off for the last time. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, authorities soon came across even more disturbing evidence on Lisanne's Canon PowerShot, which was found in her backpack. On the day of April 1st, when Kris and Lisanne first embarked on their hike, a few photos were taken. Both girls looked happy and appeared to be in very good spirits. Lisanne took a selfie of both of them at the summit, as well as individual shots of both of them at the summit. Again, a pretty normal thing for 2 girls to do. It was beautiful weather, they'd made it to the top, and they seemed to be very happy in the photos. Experts who looked at the photos and the placement of the sun in the photos concluded that the women had reached the summit and had taken the photos around 1 p.m. And then the pictures pointed to the girls making a very odd decision. Lisanne had snapped a few more photos of Kris in an area of the trail that was past the Continental Divide. One of the last photos that was taken was of Kris on a quebrada, and she was standing on a rock in the middle of a stream. This particular location was about an hour away from the summit, heading further away from Boquete. This was extremely alarming since that area of the trail was in the remote Bocas region, which was more jagged, ruthless, and difficult to navigate. However, in the photos, the girls didn't appear to be in any type of distress, although this is up for debate since some people do get really odd vibes from the photos. Now, the change in the trail is very obvious almost immediately after you pass the summit. So the biggest question is, why did Lisanne and Kris continue forward, especially when they weren't experienced hikers in that type of environment and hadn't packed much? Many believe it was because the women thought that the trail would circle back around and drop them back off in Boquete. However, some think that the women traveled into the relentless jungle for other reasons, which we'll get to later on in this video. After that first day when they embarked on the hike, no photos were taken whatsoever on Lisanne's camera, which is extremely odd since we know that both girls are in trouble at this point and have already made several emergency calls without success. Then on April 8th, 7 days after the girls first ran into trouble, Lisanne's camera was turned back on, and between the hours of 1 and 4 a.m. in the complete darkness, 90 flash photos were taken. And the photos were absolutely puzzling. One photo showed the girls' belongings spread out on a rock with some toilet paper and candy wrappers. Another seemed to be a shot of a red marker on a rock, while another shot captures what appears to be a cliff or a drop-off of some kind. And most disturbingly, there is a close-up photo of Kris Kremers' head with blood near her temple. Now, the rest of the photos have never been released to the public. What exactly was going on? Who was taking the photos, and what did the photos mean? Experts who looked at the photographs stated that they believe that the clear photos were deliberately taken in a certain order and that the photographer was taking the photos for a specific reason. Also, what was even more alarming was that one picture had been intentionally deleted. The last of the daytime pictures of Kris that were taken on April 1st were numbered as 0507 and 0508. When you look at the nighttime photos that were taken a week later on April 8th, the first image was timestamped at 1:30 a.m. and was numbered 0510. So what happened to image 0509? So when you look at the photos that Lisanne took on April 1st, some of them weren't exactly the best pictures. Some of them were blurry, they were out of focus, but they were never deleted. They were not deleted, they were kept. Many of the nighttime photos are blurry and out of focus, and they also weren't deleted either. So why was only image 0509 missing? Image 0509 wasn't even able to be recovered by experts, which leads many to believe that it was actually deleted with a computer to fully get rid of it. So was there something in that photo, or more importantly, was there someone aside from Kris and Lisanne in that photo? Also in the nighttime photos, you can see a bridgehead over the Culebra. The bridge, also known as a monkey bridge, consists of 3 cables that cross the river. The cables are about 25 feet above the river, with one of the cables being for your feet and the other 2 being on either side of that cable for your hands to hold on to. Now, it's a very dangerous bridge, and even locals who are familiar with it will stay away from it under certain weather and river conditions. This monkey bridge which was the last identifiable site that the women were at, which was about 6 hours away from the Continental Divide, which is unreal. Again, this section of the trail is not easy to navigate and very few travel it without an experienced guide or guides. After Lisanne's backpack was found, the authorities immediately started up the searches again and focused in around the area where the backpack was found and along the Kremers. However, since the location was so remote and so isolated, First Superior Prosecutor Betsaida Petey, who was assigned to the case, asked for the Indios, an Indian tribe that was located in the region, to search instead. So essentially, the Indios who were not trained in criminal investigations were now in charge of the searches. Soon after, the Indios discovered Kris's shorts neatly zipped and folded on a rock on the opposite side of the bank, a few miles away from where Lisanne's backpack had been found. Now, some reports say that her shorts were actually found in the water, but most of the sources I came across stated that they were found neatly folded on top of a rock high above the water line. But I do believe the locals when it comes to this, and the locals have always said that they found her shorts in the actual river. Then, around 2 months later, the Indios began to find human remains. On June 19th, in a search closer to where Lisanne's backpack was found, the expert guide who was supposed to meet with Lisanne and Kris the day after they went missing, and 6 Indios came across a pelvic bone, and they also came across a hiking boot and sock with a human foot still inside of it behind a tree. After both were sent in for testing, the pelvic bone was confirmed to be Kris's and the foot was confirmed to have belonged to Lisanne. And not long after that, searchers began to find more evidence, including one of Kris's boots, in addition to human remains that had been scattered along the same riverbank. In total, 33 bone fragments were recovered, and authorities were able to identify them as belonging to both Lisanne Froon and Kris Kremers. Out of the 33 bones that were found, 28 of them were metatarsals of Lisanne's left foot. The highest placed remains were found at about 2,300 feet above sea level. At that elevation, temperatures are more cool, which makes the decomposition process slower. However, when the bones were found, both women's remains appeared to be in very different conditions. Lisanne's remains and their state of decomposition were more consistent with the timeline of their disappearance and their location, while Kris's bones were so white that they actually appeared to be bleached, which is extremely odd, and I'll definitely be coming back to this. Authorities began to ask locals, guides, and other travelers if they had any information about Kris and Lisanne or about what may have happened to them, and no one had any useful information. No one had seen or heard anything. Dr. Frank van de Goot, who was the head of the Dutch team, returned to Panama with a team of examiners and experts in January of 2015. They attempted to hike the Pianista Trail and take the same route that Kris and Lisanne had taken, but were unable to get to the riverbanks of the Kremers where the remains were found due to weather conditions. Eventually, the Panamanian authorities concluded that Kris and Lisanne were dragged to death in the Kremers and that the remains were eventually dismembered by scavengers. However, several people had major problems with the authorities' version of the events and didn't believe that they had conducted a proper investigation. Also, many, including experts, did not believe that the physical evidence that was left behind supported the authorities' conclusion. In an article by the Daily Beast who extensively covered the women's deaths, a journalist named Adelita Corriat stated that many believe that a serious investigation was never conducted because the Panama Public Ministry didn't want the women's deaths to affect tourism in the country. In 2013, a year before Kris and Lisanne's deaths, Panama was visited by over 1.5 million tourists, with each tourist spending between $365 and $385 a day on average. Most of Panama's tourists came from the United States, Canada, and Europe, where Kris and Lisanne were from. She hinted at a possible cover-up and pointed to other victims who had gone missing in the same area of Panama and also received very little attention. In fact, more than 24 murders and disappearances took place in the same region of Panama, with more than 2/3 of them occurring after 2014 when Kris and Lisanne were found dead. The Daily Beast also claimed that they received a leaked copy of the Chiriquí State Judicial Report regarding the case. Supposedly, in this report, it states that the case of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon is a homicide case and a crime against personal integrity. Journalist Adelita Corriat went on the record to tell the Daily Beast that she had had a meeting with the district attorney for Chiriquí, who told her that the case could be reopened at any time if evidence was presented that pointed to a viable suspect. Then there was a lot of controversy around the way the evidence was handled in this case. There was no chain of custody for the women's remains and belongings, and there was no effort to make sure that the evidence wasn't contaminated. For example, when Lisanne's backpack finally reached the Dutch Forensic Institute, examiners discovered 33 separate prints on the items in her backpack. However, they couldn't do much with that information since Panamanian investigators hadn't made print records related to the case. Also, when they began finding the women's remains, Panamanian authorities did not set up grid searches, and prosecutor Betsaida Pidi wouldn't allow experts from the Institute of Legal Medicine and Forensic Sciences to assist in the case. Due to this, no experts from the institute were allowed to come in and collect insects, soil, vegetation, or samples, which could have helped them conclude where an accident may have occurred on the trail. In fact, most of the evidence that was found by the Indios and wasn't even found by official search teams. So the Panama Public Ministry's official version of the events is that Kris and Lisanne's deaths were due to a hiking accident and that the women had been dragged to death by the Rio Culebra and were then scavenged by animals. But there were problems with that story. They couldn't explain what the actual accident was or give a time of death. They couldn't explain how almost none of Kris and Lisanne's remains were actually recovered. They couldn't explain how the women could have been dragged to death in the Culebra when the tide was low in April and wouldn't be high enough to really drag them away. They couldn't explain why the women's bodies didn't wash up intact like others have in similar circumstances. They couldn't explain quite a lot, and the physical evidence just simply didn't add up with their story, and we're going to go over why it doesn't add up. So really quickly before we go any further, I'm just going to pull up a map and tell you what everything means, because this map was so helpful for me when I was doing my research. Again, this is such an isolated area, so you can't exactly pull it up on Google Maps and zoom all the way in. So this map is extremely helpful, and I just want to pull it up so you can see where everything was actually found. For me, I'm a visual person, so I actually have to look at things to kind of fully understand it. So if any of you are the same way, hopefully this map kind of helps. Alright, so this is a map that was used, and it shows the remains and it shows the search routes that Cineproc did, supposedly. So if you look at the red markings on the map, those are actually all the locations where Cineproc searched. As you can see, none of the searches were actually up in the region where everything was mostly found, but we'll start at the very beginning. So if you go down here to the orange dot, that is the start of the Pianista Trail that Kris and Lisanne took on April 1st. When you go up, you see the green dot. That right there is the summit, or the Continental Divide, or the El Mirador. It goes by all three of those things, but I've been calling it the Continental Divide in this video. So that is where Kris and Lisanne took the photos on April 1st. They were there about 1 p.m. If you go a little bit further down, that little diamond shows where the first quebrada was. That's the last picture of the daytime pictures where we see Kris crossing on, and she's standing on a rock of some kind. So we know that the girls made it there on April 1st and that they were still okay at that point. Again, the quebrada is in the Bocas region. You can see that they've crossed the divide. As you get down into the two red dots, these are being marked as houses. I don't know whom they belong to or if they factored into anything in any way, but those are marked as houses. If you go a little bit further down, you're going to see the light blue dot, and that is where Kris's shorts were found. Again, some people say they were found neatly folded on top of a rock, while others say that they were actually in the river. I believe that they were in the river. If you go up a little bit further to the dark blue dot, that is where Kris's pelvic bone was found and where Lisanne's shoe was found with the foot still inside. A little bit higher up is the pink dot. That is where Lisanne's backpack was recovered. And then if you go all the way up here where that yellow dot is located, that is where Kris's right 10 rib was found. So that is pretty high up, pretty far away from everything else, and again, nowhere near where Cineproc was searching. So that is this map. I'm going to, of course, bring it up multiple times throughout the rest of this video, but I wanted to explain it first before I just brought it up and put it on the screen for you guys. So hopefully that makes it a little bit more easier for you to understand where everything is located and where all of the searches were. One of the most puzzling pieces of this case were the remains that were found, or should I say, the lack of remains that were found. In total, 33 bone fragments were found, and 28 of those bones were metatarsals from Lisanne's left foot, which was found still inside the sock and boot that she wore on the hike. Now, on average, the adult human body has 206 bones, so keeping that in mind, aside from the 28 bone fragments that were found basically protected in her boot, only 2 of Lisanne's bones were found, which were her tibia and her femur. In total, only 2 of Kris's bones were found, which were the left side of her pelvis and her right number 10 rib. That's it. Less than 10% of Lisanne's bones had been recovered, and less than 5% of Kris's bones were found. So where were the rest of the bones? Authorities blamed animals for the bones being missing and scattered, but the remains were found at a high elevation, and there are no large animals at that elevation in that particular mountain range. According to experts, no crocodiles or other predators that had the capability of crushing large bones would have been in the region where the remains were found. Also, there were 0 signs, I'm going to repeat that, there were 0 signs of trauma or marks on the bones, which is inconsistent with a body being scavenged by an animal or the 2 women being dragged to death in the Kalibra. A forensic anthropologist who worked on the case but refused to go on the record stated, quote, "There's no evidence that animals scavenged the women. No claw marks, no bite marks from the fangs of animals. No marks that would indicate that they had been broken up on river rocks either. There are no discernible scratches of any kind on the bones, neither of natural nor cultural origin. There are no marks on the bones at all," end quote. So basically, the condition of the bones completely contradicts the official story that the Panama Public Ministry has given. The same forensic anthropologist went even further and addressed the bleaching of Kris's bones and stated that he had seen similar circumstances in cases involving Mexican cartels. He said, quote, "The low number of bones, the lack of marks on them, and the presence of bleaching, all of those could suggest the use of lime or a similar chemical to speed up decomposition. Their hitmen will use lime to break down corpses in a hurry. I just can't tell you it was an accident because the science does not support that conclusion," end quote. Another forensic expert also weighed in on the case, and she specifically focused in on Kris Kremers' bones. Dr. Georgina Pacheco specializes in analyzing how microclimates and ecosystems in the region can impact the effects of burial, decay, and preservation. So basically, she is the perfect person to look at Kris's bones and determine if it's natural or not for them to be bleached in that amount of time. After reviewing Kris's autopsy report, Dr. Pacheco said that there should have been no bleaching on the bones whatsoever, and she referenced a similar high-profile case that she had worked on. A hiker named Cody Dial disappeared in the same chain of mountains as Kris and Lisanne did. When Cody's remains were eventually found 2 whole years later after he went missing, more than 90% of his skeleton was intact and there was no bleaching in the bones. Another high-profile forensic anthropologist, Dr. Kathy Reichs, commented on Lisanne's foot that was found. According to some press releases from the Panama authorities, Lisanne had multiple broken bones in her foot that were only consistent with a fall. However, Dr. Reichs said that that seemed like a bold statement to make considering the Panama authorities refused to release both Lisanne and Kris's autopsies for independent review. To this day, the Panama authorities refuse to release both women's autopsies. And the big question is, why? If independent review could help shed light on what happened to both women, why not release the autopsies? Then there was the clothing. Both women were in very minimal clothing when they set off on their hike and were wearing tank tops and shorts. None of their actual clothing was recovered aside from Kris's shorts and their 2 bras that were found in Lisanne's backpack. Now, again, many reports state that Kris's shorts were found neatly folded on a rock above the waterline. However, like I mentioned before, the locals in the area maintain that the shorts were found in the river. Either way, Kris's shorts being found where they were is suspicious. If Kris's shorts were found neatly folded on a rock, obviously, how did they get there? It's entirely possible a local came across them and folded them and set them there, not really thinking much of it. However, it doesn't explain how Kris's shorts were found so far away from Kris. If the shorts were actually found in the river like the witnesses in the region claim, it still doesn't explain how they actually got there. If Kris fell into the Kalibra and was dragged to death, her shorts should have traveled with her. However, we know that that did not happen since the shorts weren't found by any of Kris's remains. The Kalibra didn't take Kris's shorts off, and I'm assuming Kris wouldn't have taken her own shorts off after she had fallen in and was trying to fight for her life or was even unconscious. So again, it brings us back to the big question. Why were Kris's shorts found so far away from Kris? Then we have to look at the boots that both girls were wearing on the hike. Even hikers who prepare for long and strenuous hikes have to turn back around due to their boots being absolutely shredded by the terrain. Again, Lisanne and Kris weren't experienced hikers in this type of climate and had pretty basic hiking boots on. We also have to remember that once they passed the Continental Divide, they were met with more unforgiving terrain. However, Lisanne's boot that was recovered appeared to be in fairly good condition, and Kris's boot that was found appeared to be in even better condition. To me, this kind of stood out. How are both women's boots in such good shape? They've gone through hours worth of hiking and have supposedly been submerged and dragged in the Kremers and then moved by scavengers to another location. There didn't appear to be any animal bite marks on the boots or any other significant damage. Then there is the backpack, which again is another huge piece of evidence in this case. The backpack was found approximately 12 hours away from the Continental Divide. The backpack was in extremely good condition, and all of the personal items in the backpack were in good condition as well. So just to refresh our memory, since there's so much information in this video, Lisanne and Kris's cell phones, Lisanne's Canon PowerShot camera, Lisanne's passport, $83 in cash, 2 pairs of sunglasses, Lisanne and Kris's bras, and a water bottle were all found in Lisanne's backpack. All of the items in the backpack were intact, and the cell phones and the camera were in working condition. First of all, how is that possible? If the women had been dragged in the Kremers, you would assume that Lisanne's backpack would have traveled with Lisanne, which would lead to the electronic devices being submerged in water. In fact, the backpack was found downstream from their fragmented remains, so if they were submerged in water, how are the electronics still working? Even if you take the Kremers out of the equation, there was still heavy rain in that time period, which would have most likely left the backpack, along with the contents inside of it, wet. But that wasn't really the case. Sure, they could have been a little bit wet or damp, but if an electronic is super wet and is submerged, it's very unlikely that it will be in working condition. Then there are Kris and Lisanne's bras. Why were they in the backpack in the first place? We know for a fact that they were the bras that the women were wearing on the day of the hike. In the selfie photo that Lisanne took of herself and Kris at the summit, you can see a part of her bra actually sticking out, and it matches one of the bras inside of the backpack. We can assume that the other one belongs to Kris. When the women already had minimal clothing on and are being exposed to harsh weather conditions, why would they take an article of clothing off? I have thought of a couple reasons why the girls might have done that, and so have other people, so we'll definitely come back to it. However, the bras being in the backpack is strange all around. Then there are the photos. On April 8th, 90 photos were taken between 1 and 4 a.m. Surely there was a reason for these photos being taken during that specific time frame. The women hadn't used the camera since April 1st when they set off for their hike. So what made them, or one of them, or someone, pull out that camera in the middle of the night on April 8th when it was pitch black and raining? The photos aren't very clear, and only a few have been shown to the public. One photo, though, that I want to talk about and point out clearly shows a distinct large rock with red markers on it, and those who have traveled to Panama and hiked that trail have said that that rock is right next to a monkey bridge that is used for crossing the river. And we talked about the monkey bridge a little earlier on in this video. One of the other photos shows Kris's hair with what appears to be blood near her right temple. As far as I know, the full photo of Kris has never been released to the public due to the family's wishes, but it is up close, and we do know that there was blood present. It's unknown if Kris is alive or deceased in the photo. It's possible that the camera was brought out at that moment because something had happened to Kris, and whoever was taking the photos, presumably Lisanne, wanted to try and document what had happened, which leads us into the first theory of what happened in this case. The first theory is that the women's deaths were accidental and that no foul play was involved. I think this is obviously a likely scenario, and many locals who live in the area who believe in the Panama Public Ministry's findings believe that something happened while the women or one of the women attempted to cross the monkey bridge. Again, the nighttime photos provided the last identifiable place where the women were at, and it was near that monkey bridge. It's possible that Kris had attempted to cross the bridge right before the photos were taken and fell, which led to a head injury of some kind. The only thing that immediately points away from that is that her hair does not appear to be wet in the photo and actually appears to be quite clean considering they've been lost for 8 days at that point. But let's just say that the photos were taken right after Kris has fallen and hurt herself. Maybe Lisanne takes out her camera and begins to snap photos of the location and the distinct rock by the monkey bridge because Kris is now unable to move forward, and Lisanne knows that she needs to go find help and is taking these photos so that she can remember where she left Kris. It's also possible that Kris had suffered from some sort of injury before they arrived at the monkey bridge. Maybe Kris suffered from a TBI, or the women didn't want to cross the bridge because Kris was not in the best of shape for whatever reason. It's possible they decided to wait by the monkey bridge for a day or two to see if anyone came along. To me, this kind of backs up the photo of some of the women's possessions and candy wrappers being laid out on the rock, which could point to them being in that location for a period of time, maybe a day or two. I think it's possible that the bras could have been removed and used as tourniquets if there was a serious injury. I don't know if a lot of blood was found on the bras. I don't know if the Panama authorities even looked for that, since there didn't really seem to be much of an investigation. So maybe they were used as tourniquets, maybe they were used as markers. I really don't know why they would have taken them off. It's possible that on April 8th, when the photos were taken, that Kris died from her injuries. If that were the case, it's possible that Lisanne was trying to document what happened to her best friend and where. This would explain why Lisanne took the photo of Kris and then took the photo of the rock near the bridge and the other photos that showed the drop-off or the cliff. But all of those scenarios don't fully explain why 88 other photos were taken and why they were taken in the middle of the night in the dark. Now, if Kris had fallen from the monkey bridge and had sustained some sort of head wound, or if she had actually succumbed to her injuries from an earlier accident, why didn't Lisanne wait for another hour to take the photos at daybreak? When I looked it up, it said that sunrise took place at 6:24 a.m. on April 8th, 2014. So if that's the case, why didn't Lisanne wait a few hours so that she could get better pictures of the area? I guess it's possible if Kris was still alive that Lisanne felt that she didn't have time to wait, but it again was pitch black, and I'm sure Lisanne knew that she wouldn't have been able to make it very far without light. This could explain the other 88 photos that were taken. It's possible that Lisanne was using the flash as a light source to try and navigate. However, when you're in the dark like that and use something like a flash, it causes momentary blindness because your eyes have become accustomed to the dark. So I don't really know if that's why they would do that. I don't know if it would have been very effective, and I think they would have realized that pretty quickly, or Lisanne would have realized that pretty quickly. It's possible that the women heard something in the jungle and used the camera flash to try and ward off what they thought were animals. It's also possible that the women thought that they heard a helicopter or noise and used the flash to attract attention. Some believe that Kris and Lisanne documented those photos before they attempted to cross the monkey bridge, and that either one woman fell in and the other tried to help her and also fell in, or that both women tried to cross at the same time and fell into the river together, which led to their death. However, there are some problems with the monkey bridge theory. If Kris had fallen from the monkey bridge, that would mean that her shorts would have had to have somehow come off of her body within a few hundred meters in order for them to be located in the spot where they were found. And it meant that her body had to have been broken up within 1.24 miles for her fragmented pelvis bone to have been located in the spot where it was found. Now, if we look at Lisanne, it means that if Lisanne fell off of the monkey bridge and entered the river, that her body would have also had to have been broken up within 1.24 miles for her entire left foot to have been located where it was found. Again, Lisanne's left foot and boot weren't found on the riverbank and were found behind a tree. It would also mean that Lisanne's backpack would have traveled in the river without her, since it was found downstream from Lisanne's foot and Kris's pelvis without any trace of Lisanne. If the bag had traveled downstream, how did it end up in the location where it was found, and how are the electronics not affected by the water exposure? We also have to look at the women's phones and how they fit in with the camera activity. Now, Lisanne's phone died on April 5th, but Kris's phone was active on the 5th and was powered on and off twice to check for a signal. Then, from April 6th on, whoever was handling Kris's phone was unable to enter the accurate PIN code. If we're working under the accident theory, this means that Kris is either no longer alive or not in the right state of mind to enter her PIN code on April 6th, and that Lisanne is trying to access her phone but does not know the PIN. So from that information, we can assume that something happened to Kris on April 6th that prevented her from entering her PIN into her phone. However, we do know that Kris and Lisanne were still together on April 8th when the photos were taken, since one of them is of the back of Kris's head. Again, I think it's possible that something happened around the monkey bridge and that Kris and Lisanne decided to wait there for a day or two to regroup or see if someone came along. Again, we don't know if Kris was alive or deceased in the photo that was taken on April 8th, but even if the women entered the river at some point near the Monkey Bridge, it still does not explain the fragmentation of the bones and where the bones were eventually located. Carl Weil, who's the director of the Colorado Wilderness Medicine School and a former cadaver lab supervisor, researched the case and stated that most drowning victims or those who fall in rapids are usually found in one piece downstream. According to Weil, some don't even make it that far and get stuck in between rocks or log jams. He went on to say, quote, "It's almost unheard of for drowning victims to break up into tiny fragments," end quote. He also stated that it was almost impossible for it to happen in less than 2 months, which was the amount of time it took to find Kris and Lisanne's remains. He also addressed how Kris's bones were found completely bare and concluded, quote, "After 2 months, the bones should not be bare, but still covered with significant amounts of flesh, unless, of course, there was human intervention," end quote. This brings us into our second theory, which is that foul play was involved in Kris and Lisanne's death. Even though Panama is considered to be a safe country, it's the same as every other country, and every country has its dark side. Like I mentioned before in this video, more than 24 murders and disappearances have taken place in the same region of Panama, with more than 2/3 of them occurring after 2014 when Kris and Lisanne were found dead. One of the most notable cases was the murder of Catherine Johannet, who was killed on a hiking trail in the Bocas del Toro region in 2017. Now, even though Catherine's murder was solved, many of the other cases remain open and have received very little attention and media coverage. One of these cases actually involved a British hiker who went missing in the Boquete area in 2009. 29-year-old Alex Humphrey traveled to Panama and arrived in Boquete on August 13th to go backpacking. He left his hostel room one day and vanished without a trace. His body has never been found. Now, that case really stood out to me because he was actually staying in Boquete, where Kris and Lisanne were staying when they disappeared and were eventually found in 2014. Now, when we look at Kris and Lisanne's case, there are several men who were familiar with or living in the Boquete area who either had contact with Kris and Lisanne or had criminal pasts. And we'll start with one of the men who last saw Kris and Lisanne alive and was one of the first people to stumble across their remains. This man was the experienced guide that Kris and Lisanne had met on April 1st. He was the guide who offered to take them on an all-inclusive trip up the Pianista and further into the jungle for an overnight stay at his ranch. I'm not going to be identifying this man in the video because he's never been named as a person of interest or as a suspect in the case. He's still currently a guide and is known for that specific hike up the Pianista and across the Continental Divide, which he continues to take tourists on to this day. When he offered to take them on that specific trip, the women declined but planned to meet with him the following day on April 2nd so that he could take them to a ranch in Alto Quiao. Now, when they failed to show up, the guide actually went to the hostel where they were staying and to their host family. A police report was leaked to the Daily Beast, and in that report, Panamanian authorities accused him of actually searching the women's room without a police escort, and they accused him of potentially tampering with evidence, which is pretty big. It's also reported that he immediately went searching for the women on April 3rd before Cineproc even became involved in the search. In that same police report, the guide specifically mentioned the Pianista when he was asked about the women's disappearance. However, at that point, nobody really knew where Kris and Lisanne had gone since they didn't leave a note or tell anyone where they were going. And on April 2nd, they were supposed to meet with the guide to go to Alto Quiao, which is in the opposite direction of the Pianista. So many wondered why the guide would automatically think that the women hiked the Pianista when it wasn't anywhere near where he was supposed to meet them on the 2nd. Supposedly, in this same report, the guide spoke of the location where Kris and Lisanne's remains were eventually found. Again, this report was taken almost immediately after Kris and Lisanne were reported as missing, so it's very odd that he would immediately go search for them on April 3rd. It's odd that he somehow pointed out the Pianista right away when they could have taken several other trails, and it's very, very suspicious that he pointed out the specific location where the remains were eventually found. When the Daily Beast started covering this case extensively, they sent multiple journalists to the ground, and there was a lot of rumors swirling around Boquete, and many of them involved this local guide. There were several rumors circulating around this guide and how he may have orchestrated Kris and Lisanne's abduction in order to commit a sex crime deep in the forest. Now, when the reporters began to ask locals about the controversial guide, they got two very different pictures. Some people depicted him as being kind, respected, extremely knowledgeable, and extremely good at what he did. In fact, they described him as being the best at what he does. Some went on to say that he was a hero in the investigation and that he worked hard to find the women, which he eventually ended up doing. However, other locals and one tourist that he worked with had a very different opinion. The tourist that agreed to go on the record was a 25-year-old German photographer who had rented out a cottage on the guide's isolated farm in the jungle. The woman said that the guide spoke some English and German and said that he only worked with female tourists. She went on to say that the guide had a strong dislike for Americans and preferred to work with tourists from Europe. She believed that the guide was in his 60s when she was staying on his property, but described him as being incredibly strong with a lot of endurance. She went on to say that he had made some advances towards her and that when she politely rejected him, that he became like a panther, in her own words, and actually picked her up to see how much she weighed, which she thought was odd. Tensions continued to build between her and the guide, and she eventually ended up leaving his property without incident. Another woman who worked at one of the largest hostels in Boquete also went on the record and said that they didn't allow this specific guide on their property and no longer booked tours with him because of his inappropriate habits with female clients. A tour organizer also went on the record and said that the owner of the company that she worked for hated the guide because he was known to sexually harass his female customers. Even when I was doing my research, I came across a post on Reddit from a Dutch man who stated that he had traveled with his girlfriend to Boquete and encountered this same guide. In his post, he stated that the guide continually touched his girlfriend even when she asked him to stop, and that he and his girlfriend got extremely weird vibes from him all around. So which description of the guide is true? Was he the kind, noble hero who was just trying to help out in the investigation, or was there something more sinister at play? Regardless of where the exact truth lies, it's very interesting that this guide was one of the last people to see Kris and Lisanne alive and was one of the first people who found their remains. I also think that it's very strange that this guide offers to take them up the Pianista and past the Continental Divide, and then Kris and Lisanne, who declined his offer, end up hiking the Pianista and going past the Continental Divide where the remains are eventually found. Based on maps of where the remains were located, the guide's isolated ranch house was only a few miles away, which again is very suspicious. At the very least, it's a big coincidence. The guide was questioned by the police in the initial days of the investigation, however, no charges were ever brought against him. When the guide was confronted with the allegations, he told the Daily Beast that he had already told authorities everything he knew and directed all of their questions to the Attorney General and Cineproc. The guide went on to say that if Cineproc knew how to do their jobs, that the girls would have been saved. Then there was a taxi driver who dropped Kris and Lisanne off at the Pianista, Leo Gonzalez. By all accounts, Leo was a good, friendly person who stayed out of trouble. But did he maybe see something that he shouldn't have seen that got him into trouble? Almost a year after Kris and Lisanne's remains were found on the banks of the Culebra, Leo's body was found floating in a shallow stretch of water in a mini canyon in the area called the Gualaca. He was found there by rock climbing instructor Cesar Castillo, who was teaching a class nearby. Cesar Castillo said, quote, "It's easy to swim there with no strong current, and we never heard any cries for help or splashing around like he was in trouble. We know he didn't hit his head on a rock because there was no blood or bruising," end quote. Shortly after discovering Leo, Castillo pulled him out of the water and attempted to give him CPR, but he was beyond help at that point. His death was eventually ruled as a drowning. Is it possible that Leo knew more about Kris and Lisanne's deaths, or did he see something that he wasn't supposed to see and was then taken care of by someone else? Then there was a man named Frank Pardo, who was a former sicario or hitman with the Mexican cartels who broke out of prison in March of 2013. He had been convicted of murdering a woman in 1996 and was known to have ties to the Boquete area. In April of 2014, when Kris and Lisanne disappeared on the Pianista, Pardo was still at large. Then there was Juan Pino Cardenas, who was charged with murdering a woman in March of 2017. At the time, he was living just 20 minutes away from Boquete. To this day, authorities are still trying to find out if he's linked to other missing persons in the area. Did either of those men have something to do with Kris and Lisanne's deaths? When we look at the foul play theory, not everything fits into it, just like everything doesn't fit into the accident theory. For example, we can assume that Kris and Lisanne were in possession of their phones and Lisanne's camera up until April 8th, because the photos were powered on and off regularly to check for signals. If they are being kept there by a killer or killers, why would they let them hold on to their cell phones? If it was someone local to the area, I'm sure they knew that there was no reception and that it didn't really matter if the women had their phones, but it still seems strange that they would allow them to keep their cell phones and keep turning them on and checking for signals. But as I was kind of in this line of thinking, I began to wonder if it was possible if there could have been an accident and or foul play involved. The first thing that came to my mind almost immediately was, what if someone came across them and offered to go get help, told them to stay put, or offered to walk the trail with them? If that person was the guide, the women would have trusted him since they'd already interacted with him before and knew that he knew the trail well. So the following theory is something that I thought of, and not all of it makes sense, so don't be too hard on me. I know that not everything fits together. I know that everything doesn't completely come together. I tried to think about the person who may have done it, the phone activity, the timeline, the camera activity, and tried to put everything together to see what makes sense in my opinion. It's also possible that things happened in a different way. It's also possible that things didn't happen this way at all. I'm interested to hear what you guys think happened, if you think foul play was involved. I guess what I'm trying to say is that even as I read off my own potential theory, I don't fully know if I'm 100% behind it, but to me it's the only way that everything makes sense. So this is my theory. I'm going to go ahead and read it, kind of like what I did with Joan Risch in that video, because it's super specific and it's super long, so I'm just going to read it off. On April 1st, Lisanne and Kris go and hike on the Pianista Trail. The guide may have known they were looking at the Pianista since he offered to take them on a guided hike on the Pianista and into the Bocas region for an overnight stay at his ranch before they left. The women might have thought about the guide talking about the trail beyond the Continental Divide and decided to explore some of it. We know that the women crossed the Continental Divide and have at least reached the first quebrada by mid-afternoon since there's a photo of Kris crossing it. Maybe they believe that the trail would circle around and they continue on further into the Bocas region. They quickly realize that they're lost and attempt to call for help 2 times a short time later. The next day, on April 2nd, the guide is expecting the women to meet up with him, and when they fail to show up, he goes over to the hostel where they are staying and potentially enters their room and searches it without a police escort. Meanwhile, back on the trail, Lisanne and Kris attempt to call for help 3 separate times without any luck. There's no way to know if they continued forward at that point. We can assume they never went back and reached the Continental Divide again, since we do know that there is cell service at the Continental Divide, and the women never had service after they crossed it on April 1st. On April 3rd, the guide went up the Pianista to supposedly search for the women, and we know that he did this because he said he did. Now, here's where things stand out to me. On April 3rd, in the morning, the last emergency call is attempted on Kris's iPhone. There were no more attempts to call for help after that point. Is it possible that the guide actually did catch up with them at some time on April 3rd? Did he have ulterior motives? Did he offer to guide them back to help in the Bocas region, which led them further into the jungle? The women would have trusted him since they had interacted with him before and knew that he was an experienced guide. They probably would have followed him without questioning anything. The next day, on April 4th, Kris's phone was checked for a signal. It's possible that the guide continued to travel with them on April 4th and nothing of significance really happened. The guide could have been planning to do something but was trying to find the right moment and didn't take the phones from the women because he knew that they weren't going to get any reception anyway and wanted to build trust with them. When we get to April 5th, Lisanne's phone is turned on for the last time before the battery dies. Kris also checks for a signal on her phone before powering it off. Again, nothing of significance happens and they continue on their trek. Now, when we get to April 6th, things start to become strange, and I think that some sort of incident may have happened on the 6th if foul play was involved. I think that if foul play was involved, that the motive was sexual. Maybe some sort of assault took place, which explains why both women's bras were ultimately found in Lisanne's backpack. The motive was clearly not robbery since both women's phones were found in addition to Lisanne's camera and some cash. On April 6th, Kris's phone is powered on, but whoever, and in this scenario it would be the guide, is using it and enters in the wrong PIN and is unable to access the phone. It's possible that the guide was trying to make sure that no photos had been taken of him with the phone but hit a problem when Kris refused to give him the accurate PIN. At this point, the women would no longer be in possession of their cell phones. Lisanne's phone is dead at this point, so that really only leaves Kris's phone. It's honestly possible that both women were injured after the assault on April 6th. Now, this is tricky because for April 7th through April 10th, we know that there were 77 attempts to check for a signal, but we don't know the breakdown of those days. On April 7th, it's possible that another assault took place and the guy tried to get into Kris's phone and Kris again refused to give him the code. I think it's possible that on the night of April 7th that something happened which led to Kris being gravely injured or deceased. This would have had to have happened near the Monkey Bridge area. Then at some point in the early morning hours of April 8th, Lisanne's camera is powered on for the first time in 7 days in the middle of the night. Most of the photos are black, but there were a couple of photos that were clear and released to the public. One shows a huge rock with some red markers on it that's close to the Monkey Bridge. The other shows what appears to be a drop-off or cliff, and another appears to show the back of Kris's head with blood near the temple. Is it possible that the guy took these photos to try and make it look like the women had an accident near the Monkey Bridge? Locals in the area know that rock because it's so distinct, and they know that that rock is by the Monkey Bridge. So is it possible that he took those photos to not only stage the scene, but to also give himself an excuse to basically lead the search to where he wanted, which was the Monkey Bridge area where some of the remains were found? According to the map that I have, Cineproc didn't even search up in that area, so it's entirely possible that many bones are out there or even nearby, but just weren't found on purpose by the guide. He was the one who led the Indios to the small amount of bones that were found. Again, if Lisanne were taking the photos to document Kris's death or Kris being injured at a certain location, why would she have done it in the middle of the night instead of waiting for a few hours for sunrise? It's also possible that the guide looked at the camera and deleted image 0509 because he was in it. Maybe Lisanne had taken a photo in the days prior and either intentionally or unintentionally captured him in her shot. It's possible that the guy didn't know how to use the camera and fired off a few shots that were just pitch black, maybe as he was staging the scene. Maybe he set the camera down and was trying to move Kris. I think it's possible that while he was doing that, Lisanne maybe saw an opportunity and grabbed the phone and camera and made a run for it. Since it was dark, it's possible that she powered on the phone and was able to use that as a light source and to check for a signal. I think it's possible that she could have severely injured her foot, which is why there were tons of breaks in it. Maybe she was able to get away and turn the phone off to save battery and began using the camera as a light source. She could have panicked at that point and thought she was hearing things or animals and was using the light of the camera to ward them off. The flash of the light could have helped the guide actually find her, but we have to remember at this point that Lisanne would be terrified, exhausted, most likely starved, and disoriented. Since we don't know the breakdown of the signal checks from the 7th to the 10th, it's hard to say when the phone was being powered on and off. It's possible that Lisanne spent the rest of that morning checking for a signal before the guide found her. It's possible that the guide powered the phone on himself multiple times and asked Lisanne for the PIN code, not understanding that Lisanne didn't know since the phone was Kris's. At some point in the series, Lisanne would have also been killed. I would assume it would have been shortly after Kris's death. It's possible that the guide used the following days to clean up the crime scene and dispose of the women's remains with lye or a similar chemical, which explains why so few bones were found and why Kris's bones appeared to be bleached. On April 11th, Kris's phone was powered on for the last time, was left on for about an hour and 5 minutes, and was then powered off. Is it possible that the guy turned it on one last time to somehow try and gain access to her phone and was unsuccessful and thought he turned it off but didn't? Maybe as he was putting Kris's phone back in Lisanne's backpack, he realized it was on and successfully turned it off. Obviously, if the guide were involved, he would have known where to direct searches with the Indios, and he obviously would have been updated with the official search. It's possible that he planted some bones on the riverbank of the Culebra near the Monkey Bridge because it would point to the accident he wanted people to think happened. He had already taken the photos that showed Kris bleeding near the Monkey Bridge in the middle of the night. The story that he could have been trying to set up was that the women tried to cross the Monkey Bridge in the middle of the night, were injured, and fell into the river. It's also possible that he planted the backpack and put it in a place where he knew it would be discovered. This would explain why there was no significant water damage to the phones or to the camera. Aside from the lack of bones, the biggest questions that I have surround the phone and camera activity. To me, the camera activity points to both theories the most, if that makes sense. To me, it makes more sense that it was Lisanne behind the camera. However, at the same time, it's odd to me that the women didn't use the camera for 7 days after they had gone missing. They didn't use it to document parts of the trail that they were on. They didn't use the camera to leave any messages about what had actually happened. You would just think that they would use the camera to maybe even help mark things, even if they felt like they were going around in circles, that they would use the camera to take pictures of things that were distinct, so that they knew that they weren't just going in circles, but there was absolutely nothing. Is it possible that they didn't do that because the guide was actually with them and they didn't think that they were lost? Also, when you look at the cell phone activity, which is huge in my opinion, the last of their emergency calls happened on the morning of April 3rd, which was the exact same day that the guide said he went up the Pianista and looked for them. Did they stop attempting to call because they were with the guide and didn't think they needed help? They were still checking for signals, probably out of some desperation, but they never attempted to make any emergency calls after that. It's always possible that the women didn't attempt to call because they didn't have reception, but there's just something strange about it. I feel like even if you knew there wasn't reception, you would still be desperate and you would still be trying to make phone calls. So maybe you guys will disagree on that, but I don't know. I just feel like even if there wasn't reception, you would still try to call because you would just be desperate to get through. I also completely understand that they could have been trying to conserve their battery power, but a call attempt would be quick and easy. However, that being said, none of us can truly understand what it would be like to be in Lisanne and Kris's situation because no one has shared their exact same experience. So I can't really say they should have done this, they should have done that, or I would have done this, or I would have done that, because I've never been in that type of situation. However, it does seem very odd to me that they didn't try to call for help after April 3rd. To me, it's even possible that the guide caught up with them at some point on the 3rd and kept them somewhere and left them with some water, food, and candy or whatever they needed. It's possible that both women escaped and tried to hike their way out. Maybe Kris was injured while they were trying to escape, and the night photos could have been Lisanne trying to document Kris's wound. They may have come across the monkey bridge and tried to cross it, but fell and were gravely injured and eventually succumbed to the injuries or the elements. With this case, I honestly don't think it has to be one or the other. I think that there could have been a third party involved in some way, and that there still could have been some sort of accident and cover-up. The evidence that was left really points in several different directions. To me, the bones, the backpack, Kris's shorts, and image 0509 being deleted points to a third party, while the cell phone and camera activity point more to an accident. Regardless of what happened, I can't even imagine the terror that Kris and Lisanne went through. There didn't need to be a third party there or paranormal activity or some of the other theories I've seen out there for their experience to be absolutely terrifying. When I was deep in the research on this, I found myself actually holding my breath. I didn't even realize it, but as I was going through some of the photos and just looking at them, I was holding my breath because I just was so terrified. I could not imagine being behind that camera and taking those photos. I can't imagine being on that trail in the dark, not being able to see my hand out in front of me. I can't imagine seeing my best friend be injured, in some way, whether it was foul play or an accident, and not being able to help them and being on my own and not knowing where I was. The whole thing is just so terrifying. One thing that I can say is that I don't think that there was a proper investigation, and many locals and even those who worked on the case agree with that. There were more active steps that could have been taken to try and find out what happened on the trail in April of 2014. Kris and Lisanne deserved a thorough investigation, and it honestly saddens me when I think about them not receiving a full investigation due to authorities caring more about tourism and making a profit. I understand that you want people to come to your country. I understand that it's not a good look if there were 2 murders on a hike, which is a huge part of why people go to Panama. They go to backpack, they go to hike, they go to explore all of the isolated regions, but you also have to do your job, and people's lives come first. My heart breaks for their families because their families will never truly know what happened to their daughters, and it saddens me to know that Kris and Lisanne were taken from this world when they had so much life left to live. They were just 21 and 22 years old, and I think they just had so much to offer this world, and they would have gone on to do amazing things. And also, Kris and Lisanne's bravery should never be forgotten in this story. I can't imagine what they went through in those days in the jungle in the middle of nowhere, and I just want to say that I cannot believe how brave and courageous they were. It breaks my heart. It's one of those cases that I just can't shake, and it's one that I don't understand, and it's one that I just cannot seem to let go. It also makes me sad that the majority of the remains are still out there somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and I truly hope that wherever they are, that they are finally at peace. So I've kind of let you know what I think could have happened if foul play was involved, but I'm very interested to know what you guys think happened. Do you guys think it was an accident? Do you think it was foul play? Do you think it was a combination of both of those things? Let me know down in the comments below. If you like this video, please give it a big huge thumbs up for me. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button so you can see when all my videos are uploaded. Thank you so much for watching this video and for taking the time to learn more about Kris and Lisanne's story today. With that, I'm going to go. Again, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you on my next one. Bye.